Minister Iswaran.
Mr. Speaker, I thank all the members for their active interest in this bill and also for their support. They've raised a series of questions and suggestions on a range of issues pertaining to the bill, and I will endeavor to address them. And in particular, my responses will focus on the broad policy points pertaining to safety, reliability, and accessibility, which is the key thrust of this legislation. First, on the issue of safety-related regulations, which will apply to all chargers, including those which are already installed. Mr. Saktiandi Supat asked whether it is excessive to have three separate regimes for approval, registration, and licensing. Sir, all three aspects are necessary because they fulfill distinct purposes. The approval regime ensures that only safe EV chargers are sold. The registration regime holds each charger owner accountable for the safe use and maintenance of their chargers. And the licensing regime ensures the reliability of EV charging services. So there are distinct objectives served by these various components. Together, these regimes minimize the harm from unsafe charging, as Mr. James Lim has highlighted. And I would like to assure the House that we will endeavor to keep the compliance cost reasonable. And that includes, for example, the examples that Mr. Saktiandi raised, where even if there may be instances where two separate approvals are required, where they coincide with the applicant, because it's one and the same, we will endeavor to streamline those processes to minimize the friction. Mr. Edward Chia asked if the proposed regulatory regime should be reconciled with or parked under the regulatory regime for control goods and the Consumer Protection Safety Requirements regulations. Mr. Speaker, my ministry did consider this. However, those regulations are targeted at the description and advertisement of goods. As I've explained earlier, the scope of this bill goes further, and a dedicated regulatory regime under LTA is what we have assessed to be the preferred and more appropriate option. Mr. Saktiandi Supat, Mr. Sharil Taha, and Mr. Sean Huang have also asked for more details of the homologation, certification, and inspection regimes. The regimes will be underpinned by the Technical Reference 25 or TR25. These technical standards were just revised earlier this year in consultation with industry experts and academics. So members can be assured that the EV charging industry is familiar with the standards, as the industry has played an active role in its review. LTA will continue to work closely with the industry on regular future reviews as well. LTA is also working with industry players to support local R&D on promising EV charging technologies while ensuring safety, such as through regulatory sandboxes. Mr. Saktiandi asked if we have any insights into the charging solutions for motorcycles. The sandboxes for this, for motorcycle charging are in a very early stage, so it's a bit too early, or it would be premature for us to infer at this stage. But we do expect to learn quite a bit from these and other sandboxes so that we can eventually generalize the application through appropriate regulation. On Mr. Gantiampo's question, we take fire safety very seriously. It is a paramount consideration. LTA worked with the Singapore Civil Defence Force to update the fire code last year to enhance the fire safety requirements for buildings that install EV chargers. Under the revised fire code, EV chargers must have an isolation switch to cut off the electricity supply to the EV charger to facilitate emergency response. This is in addition to other charger design requirements in the TR25, such as electrical circuit breakers that minimize the risk of electrocution and electrical fires, including in the event of flooding mentioned by Mr. Donwe. But in general, many members have highlighted this concern about fires. And this is one of the reasons why we have paid specific attention to this and worked closely with the SCDF. Secondly, several members have asked how we will ensure adequate charging provision in Singapore. On Mr. Dennis Tan's query, we are planning for the charging demand of a largely electric light vehicle population, taking into account the average mileage of car drivers in Singapore and the effective range of a typical EV. So there are different parameters, and these are factored in the computation. But having said that, I want to emphasize that we are dealing with an evolving space. The technology is evolving, adoption rates, and therefore the consequential demand is also changing. And usage patterns, I think, both in terms of driving habits, but also in terms of charging habits, have yet to normalize. So we need time to monitor and assess this pattern, but we cannot wait for everything to stabilize before taking action. Because it is a dynamic situation, but it's a situation that calls for a response. And that is why we are focused on this 12,000 charging point deployment. It allows us to deploy quickly, but without incurring some of the heavier CapEx, the CapEx that is associated with, for example, the upgrading of substations. Instead, we are able to roll out the charging infrastructure in this first phase quickly because it focuses on more proximate type of or last mile type of infrastructure, such as the distribution boxes and so on, and then of course the actual charging points themselves. We want to deploy charging infrastructure quickly to support EV adoption. And the data we gather from this adoption will inform how we want to go further. And we may not need to wait till 2025, because if the data comes earlier and the patterns become more discernible, then we will have to adjust accordingly. As Mr. Ang Wei Neng has said, we also need to avoid over-provisioning, especially as the EV population today is relatively small, although the take-up rates are rising. So in LTA's recent large-scale tender for charging points at HDB car parks, operators start with deploying at least 3 charging points at each car park, with the flexibility to scale up to 12 charging points. And in most cases, this can be accommodated within the current electrical capacity. And LTA will monitor the demand and launch further tenders as necessary. So essentially, we can ramp up supply if the need arises. We expect the vast majority of charging points to be low-powered. This optimizes the electrical capacity required, as charging can be done overnight when there's less demand on grid capacity. However, as Mr. James Lim and Ms. Yeo Wan Ling have said, some EV users will require fast charging, such as 2-shift taxi drivers. Our low-power charging network will be complemented with a smaller number of high-power charging points across the island. Mr. Ang Wei Neng was concerned about the ground issues in implementation. This is a legitimate concern, because when we take it to the ground, to the individual HDB car parks, there will be no end of questions around which floor of the car park the EV charging point should be deployed, and many other questions will arise, some of which have been, in fact, expressed in the course of this debate. And that is why we have established a multi-agency committee, which is chaired by SMS Amy Kaur, and Deputy Chair is SPS Bae Yam King. And on this, we have LTA and HDB, among other important agencies that have a relevant jurisdiction, in order to make sure that we are able to iron out these sorts of teething issues on the ground as we implement. Because we do not want these kinds of, if you like, regulatory hurdles to get in the way of quick deployment of the charges that we wish to achieve. As Mr. Shariel Taha has highlighted, the role of petrol stations will also have to evolve as EVs become more widespread. Some petrol stations have already started to provide fast chargers for EVs, and many electric taxi drivers charge there. The licensing regime is essential to our plans as it allows LTA to set conditions such as service uptime and also to collect data on EV charging patterns. Such data is critical to support the national master planning efforts to deploy chargers and upgrade electrical infrastructure. However, accessibility goes beyond the physical infrastructure and it includes a user experience. And this is where Mr. Don Wee's suggestion about developing a single app to integrate all service providers is pertinent. And it is indeed what LTA has been working on. Today, LTA's My Transport app allows EV users to locate and access public charging points offered by various EV charging operators. LTA has just launched a beta function displaying real-time charger availability on the app, which more operators will contribute to over time. LTA is also working with third-party platform providers to allow more EV users to access charger information on their platform of choice, including information on real-time availability. I want to assure Mr. Shariel Taha and indeed all members that LTA will be transparent about how licensees' data is used. Commercially sensitive data will only be used for LTA's internal master planning work. In general, LTA will not require EV cos to share any personal data, and LTA will only use or disclose any data collected from licensees in compliance with directions made under the Public Sector Governance Act and other relevant laws relating to confidentiality. Mr. Yip Hon Wing, Ms. Yo Wan Ling, and Mr. Edward Chia asked about preventing and deterring the inappropriate use of charging lots. Today in HDB car parks, it is already an offense for a non-electric vehicle to park in an EV charging lot. EV cos are also commercially driven to tackle this, because if a car is occupying the lot but not charging, that is loss of revenue. In some countries, EV cos have implemented idle fees and time-based pricing to discourage lot hogging. Others are looking into technological solutions to make enforcement easier. Enforcement aside, motorists must also develop a culture of responsible and gracious behavior when charging their EVs. So education and an evolving culture is key. The fact is, even with enforcement and education, it will take some time for the EV charging behavior and patterns in Singapore to normalize. And we need a collective effort to help nurture the process and allow us all to ensure that this experience is a positive one for all of us. Several members have posed more detailed questions about the licensing regime. LTA will provide updates in due course. Thirdly, let me elaborate on the mandate to provide EV charging at certain developments. Mr. Saktiandi Supad has asked why developments owned by government are not subject to this statutory requirement. As with other provisions like parking, government-owned developments will take reference from our general policy and abide by relevant internal circulars. We have already started, as members know, to deploy EV chargers on a large scale at HDB residential estates. I also have it on good authority from Mr. Speaker, no less, that the Parliament is also looking into installation of EV chargers in the car park here. So members can all model responsible EV charging behavior, and the recalcitrants will, I think, face consequences in the chamber. That's what the Speaker told me. Yeah. Let me now turn to the points raised by Mr. Louis Ng and Mr. Yip Hon Wing about applying these requirements to more redevelopments. As EV adoption is still at an early stage and not evenly distributed across developments, the mandate will not apply if existing developments do not cross the specified building or electrical work thresholds for now. We will monitor EV adoption trends and consider whether the mandate should be extended to all developments in future. The bill does allow the Minister for Transport to adjust these thresholds through regulations when needed. In the meantime, we encourage developers to plan ahead and invest in the requisite infrastructure. And Mr. Louis Ng, in particular, was concerned with the lowered voting threshold for strata title development only applying to proposals that do not tap on the MCST funds. The reason for this is simple. It is to preserve a certain equivalence in the current level of accountability and governance for the use of MCST funds. Even then, we expect the lower threshold to not really be, to be able to facilitate the installation of EV charging points because it is not a very capital-intensive exercise based on the way this is being carried out today. The more prevalent practice is for EVcos to pay for the cost of installation up front and recover it from EV users over time. And as there's greater demand from higher EV adoption, these will form a key impetus, I think, for all developers and owners of developments to further install EV charging infrastructure. I would like to share with Mr. Louis Ng and Mr. Edward Chia that the take-up of the EV Common Charger Grant has been growing. So far, we have co-funded the installation of more than 200 chargers at more than 80 condominiums with 30 applications pending review. So, of course, part of the challenge here is helping the condominium MCSDs and to navigate the process because they may not know how to go about it and so on. So LTA and BCA will work with industry players to develop guides to help condominium residents in the process of installing EV chargers. Several members have asked about the enforcement of the bill. LTA will take a pragmatic approach with safety as the paramount objective. As all chargers must be registered before use, the records of the registered responsible person for each charger will facilitate enforcement efforts. Specifically on Mr. Edward Chia's question, Clause 74 of the bill allows an authorized officer to enter premises where that officer believes on reasonable grounds that specific safety-related offenses are being committed. Mr. Dornwy asked about the transitional arrangements for existing chargers. After the transitional period of 6 months after the Act commences, chargers that do not belong to a homologated model cannot be supplied, while unregistered chargers cannot be used. This is to protect the public from potentially unsafe chargers. In this intervening period, until the Act commences, I think both on the supply side, suppliers will now take reference from this and will have to ensure that the models they are selling are homologated or belong to the homologated variety. For if they fail, then their customers will be back with them within 6 months to see what can be done to remedy it. And I would urge all who are contemplating procuring the chargers to also take reference from this requirement. Let me now briefly address members' queries on the broader EV ecosystem, which, strictly speaking, falls beyond the scope of this bill. First, on the long-term market structure of the EV charging industry. I agree with Mr. Gantiampo and Mr. Yipon Wing that it is crucial to ensure healthy competition among EVcos. LTA's large-scale tender at HDB car parks was awarded to 5 operators across 10 areas and allows for further injection of competition through future tenders at these car parks. Thus far, we have seen healthy competition in the EV charging industry, supported by the growth in market entrants over the past 2 years. Mr. Ang, Mr. Sharilta, and Mr. Saktiandi have asked how the government will ensure that EV charging services are priced fairly. Fundamentally, competition and consumer choice are the most effective means of doing so. But we will monitor the price dispersion, something that Mr. Ang raised. I understand that today the price dispersion across different charging is about 5 cents kilowatt hour. But I would like to point out that there is an inherent irony in this, because if there is a wide dispersion in the prices, does that mean that we have a more competitive market? And if we have a very narrow dispersion or in extremis just a single price across the whole of Singapore, is that a desirable outcome? So I think we have to think about this carefully, but in the first instance, our objective has been to ensure that in the award of the tenders and so on is to address the key point that Mr. Ang has been raising, which is really not having too wide a dispersion. The other thing to bear in mind is, not unlike what we see with the conventional ICE cars and so on, I'm very sure that the EV cores will provide incentives and other benefits to their regular customers. So that would be a further discount, if you will, on the prices being paid. So we need to really look at this in great detail and understand the true impact before we make any further judgments on the matter. Second, Mr. Saktiandi and Mr. Ang Wei Neng asked about the manpower development to support the EV transition. Based on a joint study by LTA and EMA last year, the number of licensed electrical workers is expected to be sufficient to meet the increased demand from the EV transition over the next 15 years. Nevertheless, EMA had been reaching out to institutes of higher learning to raise awareness of the prerequisites to become an LEW. EMA has also implemented alternate pathways to allow experienced workers to apply for LEW licenses. As for charging equipment specialists, to respond to Mr. Edward Chia, EV cores have been building up their talent pool and already employ such specialists in-house. LTA is working with the industry to provide clarity on the requirements to be a charger equipment specialist under this regulatory regime. As Mr. Edward Chia has also highlighted, our technicians and mechanics will need to be equipped to take on the opportunities offered by the EV industry. In September this year, LTA launched the National EV Specialist Safety Certification in partnership with Skills Future Singapore. Automotive technicians who have undergone relevant training on high voltage systems, safety awareness, can be certified under this scheme. We will continue to work closely with industry and IHLs to grow our talent pool. Thirdly, I agree with Mr. Shariata and Mr. Don Wee that we must ensure the proper disposal and recycling of EV batteries. To this end, since July last year, the National Environment Agency has brought into effect an extended producer responsibility scheme to ensure the proper treatment and recycling of electric waste. And this includes all EV batteries, and so everyone in the ecosystem will have to comply with it. Finally, both Mr. James Lim and Mr. Don Wee suggested adjustments to the COE system to phase out internal combustion engines. I've only been in MOT about a year, but no conversation on the vehicle system is complete without a discussion on COEs, so I thank them for bringing it up. The core objective of the COE system is to limit vehicle population. We have said that the vehicle population growth will be 0, and to have an efficient mechanism to allocate the quota. This is the case for all vehicles, and an electric vehicle is a vehicle. It is not also good policy to foist too many objectives on a single policy tool. So I would argue for members' consideration that to use the COE for multiple objectives is not an appropriate or suitable policy formulation. One of the proposals that the members have made, and Mr. James Lim in particular, I think, is to have a new segment for EVs, if I heard you correctly. So if we think through the implications of that proposal, what it means is we will have to take away supply from the other categories in order to supply a new category called EVs. So the total supply for the different segments will reduce further. And for EVs, you'll have a specific category. So I'm assuming in the members' policy design proposal, EV buyers can only buy EV COEs and not any other COE. And if you think through that, you're going to have far more minimally volatility in the price because the supply is constrained. and potentially higher prices. And it also raises a bunch of questions around how do you make that allocative decision, on what basis? Do you allocate 10%, 30%, 50%? And what is the argument that substantiates that allocative decision? So what we do is we treat all vehicles the same, because the COA system is designed to control vehicle population full stop. Whether you're ICE, hybrid, electric, maybe in future fuel cell, hydrogen, but they're all vehicles on our roads. So we control the population. And then what we do is we directly incentivize the adoption of the kinds of vehicles that we would like to promote through other policy tools for intervention. So in this case, we have incentivized the adoption of EVs through the EV Early Adoption Incentive and the Enhanced Vehicle Emission Scheme, which together provide a combined rebate of up to $45,000 of the upfront cost of an electric car. There was a suggestion that maybe we can give a 10% discount. Even at today's COE prices, $45,000 is significantly higher than that in terms of upfront cost. The Commercial Vehicles Emission Scheme also provides up to $30,000 in rebates for electric light goods vehicles. There was another point raised, which is, and I wanted to just make sure, that's why I sought the clarification from the member, Mr. James Lim, because his initial point in his speech was that PHC drivers are concerned because the cost of EVs is 82% higher. I think he said, in fact, operating costs. And then when I asked for clarification, then he said, no, it is actually ownership costs. So I had a cursory look at the site that he was using, paultan.org, I understand is the site. And in fact, the quote goes further than just saying 82% higher ownership costs. It actually says 82% higher ownership costs in the region, not just in Singapore. So it's not very clear where the number comes from, and in particular, whether it has taken into account all the schemes that we have in the context of Singapore. And the point I want to make is this: when you consider costs, there are different elements to this. There's the upfront ownership cost, which needs to take into account the specific schemes that we have put in place. There is the operating costs for the life cycle, and on that, I can assure you that, in fact, EVs are very competitive, because simply on the basis of cost per kilometer, based on today's prices, is at least no more than half what it would cost if you were driving an ICE. I'm not promoting EVs, or I'm not selling them, but these are the facts. And it does not take into account the maintenance costs, because an electric vehicle has about 20 moving parts, compared to an ICE vehicle, which has got, I'm told by engineers, 2,000 moving parts. So when you total it all up, actually the equation balances out. Perhaps what is required is for greater information and awareness amongst those who are making the choices, including PHC drivers, so that they have the full picture. But I thought it was important to make this clarification because we don't want us to be citing, internet sources, but without seeing them through in terms of the specific application in our context. To Mr. Dennis Tan's question, the electrification of goods vehicles is in fact one of our priorities. And in fact, the light goods vehicle segment saw the highest rate of EV adoption this year at around 28%. So it is working, and is working well. I have already shared that for buses, for example, because LTA is largely the procurer of buses, we will have 50% of our bus fleet, which means about 3,000 of the 6,000 buses or so will be electric by the end of the decade, and the other half will likely be hybrid. So we are moving in that direction. The part that's more challenging is the very heavy vehicles. Your big trucks and so on. And the reason is because from the point of view of propulsion power and so on, there are trade-offs. And that's why I mentioned in my earlier speech that hydrogen or related related fuel types are being considered quite actively in that regard. Mr. Don, we asked if the early adoption incentive will continue beyond next year. We are reviewing this, taking into account the upfront cost gap and life cycle cost differential between an ICE vehicle and an EV. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, to conclude, I thank members once again for their support of the bill. I have endeavored to address all their queries in the main, and I would like to assure members that the Ministry of Transport and the Land Transport Authority will study and, where possible, incorporate their specific suggestions in the design and implementation of the EV charging system. Our vision is to have a vehicle population that is electric, but that will require the collective effort of government, industry, unions, and consumers. The electric vehicles charging bill represents a first but major step in our journey to get there. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move.
Clarifications? Associate Professor James Lin.
I thank the Minister for his detailed response. I just have two quick clarifications. The first is I absolutely have no difficulty with the notion that the COE should be kept predominantly for focusing on the overall body of vehicles. But that said, if I understand correctly, if the LTA will indeed stop issuing COEs for ICE vehicles after 2030, wouldn't this ultimately be equivalent to issuing a specialized category of EV COEs, which will apply to all cars after 2030, and then you'll have an existing stock of COEs for cars from before? The second point is I would like to acknowledge that he is correct. I had misspoke that when I said it was, in fact, the operating cost. Indeed, it is the full ownership cost that I should have cited. That said, the figure was, as I clarified earlier on, a statement from a VP at Grab, which is a local outfit, and it was in the context of Eco Prosperity Conference in June this year. In fact, I believe Minister Iswaran was one of the keynote speakers at that conference. So I do believe that this 82%, at least, again, it's not my estimate, but her estimate, was set in the local context.
I thank the member for his clarifications. I may have been at the conference, but I can't take accountability for what was said there by other speakers. But I'm just pulling out what was on the website, and it says the total cost of owning an EV remains 82% higher than owning an equivalent internal combustion engine, four-wheeled vehicle, and then it says in the region, GoSet. So I think that's an important point of detail, don't you think? Because the region has got significant variations, and certainly what it means is the number that has been cited here does not necessarily take into, I don't know whether it did, but it would appear at first reading that it hasn't taken that into account. And I think that all of us in this chamber, we already have to deal with a lot of misinformation outside. So at least in the chamber, when we cite sources and so on, let's just make sure we get the facts right. And that was my main objective, to make sure that we got it right, so that whether it's a PHC driver or a HDB family wanting to buy a car or anyone else, they have the full information and the right information so that they can make the appropriate choice that fits their circumstances. And secondly, I think there is a qualitative difference between what we will be doing from 2030 onwards compared to what the member is proposing. Let me explain why. What we have said is, from 2030, we will want Singapore to move towards cleaner energy vehicles. So we will phase out ICE in the flow, and therefore all cars will have to be either electric, or you will have hybrids, or you may have other new cleaner energy vehicle sources. But they're all treated the same, and they're in the same bucket, and we treat it that way. We're not allocating a specific amount for electric, we're not allocating a specific amount for hybrid, and so on. We're just taking it as one policy position. But what the member is proposing is actually to deconstruct the current COE allocation and quota and create new elements. And my point is, this is something, I don't think we need to have a PhD in economics to infer this, because I think when you create more segmentation in the market, reduce the supply to each category, the inevitable consequence must be at least volatility and potentially, and certainly in the kind of environment we're in where demand is strong, higher prices. And that might actually end up frustrating the very objective of the member's proposal.
Question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Electric vehicles charging bill.
Committee stage, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill.
The question is that Parliament will immediately resolve itself into a committee on the bill. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that clauses 1 to 100 stand part of the bill. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The schedule. The question is that the schedule stands part of the bill. As many as of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Bill to be reported. Minister for Transport.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to report that the bill has been considered in committee and agreed to without amendment.
Third reading, what day?
Now, sir, I beg to move that the bill be now read a third time.
Question is that the bill be now read a third time. As many as of the opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Electric vehicles charging bill.